the spycraft that permeated everything we did in Hong Kong extended right up until the time that he had to escape. Because what had happened was it was really amazing. We spent the whole week reporting from Hong Kong on these stories, and not a single media outlet ever wondered, why are they in Hong Kong breaking all these NSA stories? But the minute we revealed his identity, they put it all together and realized that Edward Snowden must be in Hong Kong because we had interviewed him live from there. And so they all descended on the city, and they were all desperately searching for where he was. They had found my hotel room by bribing a variety of hotel employees, but they were looking everywhere for him. And we knew that if they found him before he was able to leave, that he would never be able to leave because they would follow him incessantly. And so we arranged for some lawyers who we were able to find in Hong Kong, who were well connected, to rush over to the hotel and literally take him out of his hotel room and put him into hiding 15 or 20 minutes before the media found him. And on that day, we were really worried that he wasn't going to be able to get out of his hotel, that the media swarm would have found him. And he talked about how he could change his appearance. He could shave his head. He could do things to his face to essentially make himself unrecognizable and be able to leave the hotel. I mean, it was at that level of spycraft that all of these events took place.
So where did he go?
Well, we put him into the hands of these lawyers who specialize in human rights law and in asylum claims, and they put him in various safe houses throughout Hong Kong, people who essentially were willing to shield him on the premise that he was going to ask the world for asylum protection from the United States government.
So then explain what his thinking was and your thinking about Hong Kong, about China, about what his chances were of one of these governments cooperating with the U.S. government in arresting him and then extraditing him.
You know, people second guess all these things that happen. You know, why did he end up in Hong Kong? Why didn't he go to Iceland? Why didn't he go, to Ecuador to begin with? And there are really good answers to all of that. But the best answer is, and he himself said this all the time whenever I would ask him about alternatives, was, he would say, look, all my options are bad options. If you're going to be a whistleblower who leaks more sensitive material about the U.S. government than anyone in history, you're not going to have very good options. They're going to know you, who you are, and where you are, and they're going to want to find you, and it doesn't matter where you go. And as it turns out, I think he planned really well. I mean, Hong Kong ended up being a great choice. They didn't get him in Hong Kong. He tried to get to Latin America and was forced by the U.S. government to stay in Russia. But that, too, turned out to be fortuitous because he's further outside of the grasp of the United States a year later than he has ever been.
Explain what happened there, because a lot of people forget why he ended up in Russia, that he traveled to Russia because he wanted to sell the Russian secrets, or that he sold the Chinese secrets. Explain how he ends up being stuck in Russia.
Well, first of all, it's just such a potent sign of how disingenuous our political discourse can be, because when he was in Hong Kong for those first 2.5 weeks, all sorts of people were asserting, obviously without evidence, that he must be a Chinese spy. This was clearly a Chinese espionage operation. And the minute he moved from Hong Kong to Moscow, those same people just switched seamlessly from he's a Chinese spy to a Russian spy and forgot or ignored the fact that they were claiming something quite different just a moment ago. Any whistleblower in the United States who's effective is going to be aggressively demonized. But what people have blocked out and what the media has successfully obscured, because it's the media that typically tries to attack Snowden by saying, oh, look, he's in this oppressive tyranny and it's hypocritical that he would be in Russia while criticizing the United States, is that he did not choose to be in Russia. He went to Moscow with the intention of flying on to Havana, which had promised him safe passage, that he could then fly to the northern part of Latin America, where he would request asylum. And it was only because on the flight from Hong Kong to Moscow, when the U.S. government, with no due process, unilaterally just revoked his passport, declared it invalid, and then bullied and threatened the Cubans out of rescinding their offer of safe passage, and he landed and realized he no longer had safe passage, did they force him to remain in Russia. And he stayed there for 5 weeks. I mean, as he always says, if I were a Russian spy, do you think I would have been given that welcome of being forced to remain in the airport for 5 weeks while the Russian government thought about what they wanted to do with me? And he only then, once he realized that he would be physically incapable of leaving Russia. Remember, during this time, the U.S. government showed how radical it would be. There was a plane that they thought that he was on. That was actually the plane of Bolivian President Evo Morales. And despite no evidence that he was on the plane, they literally forced the plane down by preventing overflight rights from several of their allies in Europe, and he was forced to land in Austria. The fact that they were willing to force down the plane of a president of a sovereign country based on a whim showed that they were physically going to force him to stay in Russia, not let him leave. And it was only then that he sought asylum. So then to try and use that against him and say, well, he's in Russia, and that undermines his credibility as a messenger, is the ultimate in irony.
But talk about Julian Assange, then, another person who is the target of the U.S. Not clear if he's been secretly indicted by the U.S. I mean, here he is holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, the role he played in Edward Snowden's escape from Hong Kong. WikiLeaks,
as an organization, deserves immense credit for what they did to protect Edward Snowden. It was daring and innovative and heroic. Obviously, Julian himself was physically incapable of leaving the embassy in London. But what they did was they dispatched somebody who has been working with WikiLeaks for many years. He's very closely associated with Julian Assange, a British woman named Sarah Harrison, who went to Hong Kong and met Edward Snowden and arranged his passage out of Hong Kong and to Russia, and then stayed with him for 5 weeks in the airport, and then 3 more months once he got asylum, just to be a witness to the world that he was being treated fairly. And WikiLeaks provided support for him and an infrastructure, legal advice, essentially the reason why Edward Snowden is a free man today and able to participate in the debate that he galvanized is because of the bravery of WikiLeaks and Sarah Harrison.
And Sarah Harrison then goes on to, well, she can't go home to London.
Right. I mean, she is concerned, almost certainly with very good reason, that if she went to London, at the very least, she would be detained under the same terrorism law that they used to detain and interrogate my partner, David Miranda, which would entitle them to take all of her things and then to question her. And if she didn't answer every single question truthfully and honestly in their eyes, they would then have the right to arrest her and prosecute her just for that. So she's essentially exiled from her own country as a result of helping Edward Snowden be protected and against persecution by his own government. So
Sarah Harrison now lives in Germany.
Right.
Glenn Greenwald, talk about how Edward Snowden got asylum in Russia.
I mean, it's really a fascinating and I think still kind of obscured series of events. The context for it is that even though the Cold War is over, the American political class still regards Russia as this enemy. I think it's just baked into the DNA of Americans at this point to hear the word Russia and to sort of react with hysteria. And so the Russian and American political classes really hate each other. And for years, there have been numerous Russian criminals that have sought refuge in the U.S. whom Putin has been demanding be returned. And the position of the U.S. government is, sorry, but we have no extradition treaty with you. And therefore, there's no way to turn them over to you, even though we would love to be able to do that. And so once Snowden ended up in Russia and the U.S. government started demanding that he be extradited and turned over, there was a lot of secret negotiations between the Russians and the Americans, and I was quite concerned at that point that was going to end in an agreement where Snowden would be turned over. But the animosity between the two political classes is so intense.
And this is even before Ukraine.
Yeah, this is before Ukraine, precisely. That even though it probably would have been in both of their interests, where they could have each gotten very valuable things, they just weren't able to come to an agreement. And then Putin saw it as a way to sort of highlight the human rights abuses of the U.S. government the way they love to highlight the human rights abuses of Russia and other countries by giving Snowden asylum.
So, Glenn Greenwald, you leave Hong Kong. Edward Snowden ends up with asylum, at least for now, in Russia. And you begin this series of articles, Laura Poitras as well, revealing these documents that you have. Now, who has these documents? That's the critical question. Does Edward Snowden have them, for example, in Russia?
Right. So there's a certain universe of documents that Edward Snowden gave to journalists. And of the journalists to whom he gave documents, directly or indirectly, only Laura and I have the full set. There are other news organizations that have enormous numbers of documents, just not the full set, including the Washington Post, including The Guardian, ProPublica, and then the New York Times. ProPublica and New York Times got theirs from The Guardian when The Guardian was concerned that the British government would order them to destroy their entire set. So there are multiple organizations that have numerous documents. Der Spiegel has got numerous documents because Laura has worked with them in Berlin. I've worked with other organizations around the world. They have lots of documents as well. So they're very dispersed at this point. Edward Snowden insists that when he went to Russia on purpose, he took no documents with him of any kind, that he gave them all to the journalists he wanted to have them in Hong Kong, and then took nothing with him. So
how you broke through. Here, you're at a point now where it is known that you and Laura Poitras had interviewed Edward Snowden. This is posted online, the video, at The Guardian, and you've written your article. We're talking about the danger Edward Snowden was in, and what about the two of you, and then what happened to Edward Snowden?
I mean, we were pretty aware from the beginning. I mean, I think one of the important parts of this story is that we knew early on that what we were going to do was going to be at least as much about media and journalism issues as it was about surveillance. And the reason is that there's a set of unspoken rules that usually govern how media outlets handle stories like this, which is if you get a lot of documents, what you do at most is you publish one or two stories. You don't publish many of the raw materials. You go to the government and extensively negotiate with them about what you can publish and what you can't. You take all sorts of guidance from them about what you should and shouldn't disclose. You do one or two stories, and then you kind of walk away before you do any real damage or disrupt anything for real. You collect some awards. You get a lot of accolades. You know, you sort of just leave the status quo be, but show the country that you've done some real journalism. And once we got the sense of how vast and sprawling this archive was, we knew we were going to do everything differently, that we were going to ignore all of those rules because we don't believe in those rules because they're corrupting. And so we knew that once we started publishing not one or two stories, but dozens of stories, and we were going to continue to publish until we were done, which is still our plan and still what we intend to do, that not just the government, but even fellow journalists were going to start to look at what we were doing with increasing levels of hostility and to start to say, this doesn't actually seem like journalism anymore because it's not the kind of journalism that they do. It doesn't abide by these unspoken rules that are designed to protect the government. And so we knew there were going to be all kinds of risks to us about threats, accusations that we were engaged in criminality and treason, the possibility that we were going to be arrested or have legal process against us. Obviously, my partner was detained for 11 hours under a terrorism law and still is the target of an ongoing criminal investigation. The Guardian's newsroom, David Miranda in London. Airport. And so, yeah, and over even the past 3 months before we came back to the U.S., Laura and I, for the first time 3 weeks ago, there was this escalating series of public threats from James Clapper, who called us accomplices, to Mike Rogers, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, who called us thieves and said that we ought to be arrested. And so there was this deliberate climate created that was supposed to make us uncertain about what our fate would be, hoping that we would then curb the reporting or otherwise be a little bit less aggressive.
Wait, I want to just show, so it's not just you saying or characterizing, since we are very concerned about people speaking in their own words, that exchange from February between House Intelligence Committee Chair Mike Rogers and FBI Director James Comey.
There have been discussions about selling of access to this material to both newspaper outlets and other places. Mr. Comey, to the best of your knowledge, is fencing stolen material, is that a crime?
Yes, it is.
And would be selling the access of classified material that is stolen from the United States government, would that be a crime?
It would be. It's an issue that can be complicated if it involves a news gathering, a news promulgation function, but in general, fencing or selling stolen property is a crime.
So if I'm a newspaper reporter for fill in the blank, and I sell stolen material, is that legal because I'm a newspaper reporter?
Right. If you're a newspaper reporter and you're hawking stolen jewelry, it's still a crime.
And if I'm hawking stolen classified material that I'm not legally in possession of for personal gain and profit, is that not a crime?
I think that's a harder question because it involves a news gathering function, could have First Amendment implications. That's something that probably be better answered by the Department of Justice.
FBI Director James Comey being questioned by House Intelligence Committee Chair Mike Rogers, who, by the way, says he will leave Congress and become a radio talk show host. Glenn Greenwald.
Well, right immediately after that hearing, Politico asked Mike Rogers, not that there was any doubt anyway, but who is it specifically who you were thinking about when you were engaged in that colloquy? And he said Glenn Greenwald. And the headlines in Politico were then, and the Huffington Post and a bunch of other places, was House Intelligence Committee Chairman accuses Glenn Greenwald of being a thief, an offense, and engaging in felonies. And so, you know, when you have those kind of accusations being made by people who are powerful within Washington, you take them seriously. And the thing about it is, even if the threats don't end up manifesting in terms of arrests, it creates this climate that's intended to be created where journalists have to be afraid that the journalism that they're doing that's supposed to be protected by the First Amendment can now be subject to arresting you and charging you with crimes in a federal court system that has been extremely deferential to the U.S. government in the post 9/11 era. And that was definitely part of the climate that got created on purpose. As a journalist, I consider it sort of an additional prize that somebody like Keith Alexander is so angry at the journalism I'm doing that he's willing to make those things up in order to discredit it. I mean, the idea of a journalist is that you ought to be adversarial to people like Keith Alexander, and I would be a lot more worried if he liked the reporting that we did and praised it than I am that he's saying things like that. But the thing that I think is so important to realize is, you know, if you go back 40 years and look at what was said about Daniel Ellsberg, who most people across the political spectrum now consider to have been heroic and justified and noble in what he did, the same exact things were said about him. In fact, Nixon officials went before Congress and accused him of being a secret Russian spy. They said that he put lives at risk. They said that people were going to die as a result of these disclosures, that he was a traitor, that he was engaged in treason, all of which have been proven to be utter fabrications. And every single whistleblowing event that has happened since then, including the 2005 NSA story in which someone in the Justice Department told the New York Times about that program, the blowing the whistle on Abu Ghraib and the torture program and the rendition program, what WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning did, the same rhetoric is constantly invoked, which is if you shine a light on what we in political power are doing in a way that we haven't authorized you to do, you're going to have blood on your hands. I mean, there's an obvious irony to being accused by a U.S. general who served in Iraq, of all places, of having blood on your hands or causing the death of innocent people. Nobody could ever surpass Keith Alexander and his fellow generals in their ability to do that. But the claim is made all the time reflexively without any evidence, because in reality, the only thing that has been harmed by the disclosures is not the lives of innocent people, it's the reputation and credibility of people like Keith Alexander. And so you can understand why they're so interested in demeaning it.
Now I wanted to ask you about the politics of the Pulitzer Prize. The Pulitzer Prize for Public Service that went to The Guardian and The Washington Post is perhaps the highest Pulitzer Prize. It's the first one named. And clearly, you and Laura Poitras led these teams. I mean, you were in the articles that are cited in The Guardian. Your name is on one after the next after the next. Right. And Laura Poitras is on both The Guardian website and bylining pieces, as well as The Washington Post, the two newspapers named. But technically, according to the rules of the Pulitzer, you each will have to say you are part of the team that won the Pulitzer, that you can't be called a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, though, of course, here at Democracy Now! We will call you that. But what about the politics of this? Because although the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service usually goes to an institution, it often, even in going to an institution, cites the bravery of a particular reporter in reporting this series of stories. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any secret about the fact that the journalism that I advocate for and engage in is controversial among a large clutch of what I would call establishment journalists. I talked about before there being these unwritten set of rules that govern how you're supposed to speak and what you're supposed to do that I consciously reject and set out to violate because I think they're corrupting. And I've been a very vociferous critic of how the establishment media in the United States conducts itself, and that's created a lot of animosity even before the Edward Snowden story. And so the people who compose this committee are the targets of that criticism and also the targets of the reporting and the way I've tried to do the journalism. So it's certainly understandable, and we've gotten reports that there was some effort on the committee to make sure that, you know, my name and Laura's name didn't sully their wonderful brand. You know, but at the same time, I mean, the way I really look at it is the prize that I'm glad that was awarded. In part because I think some of the best reporting that has been done in history, including the Washington Post investigation of Watergate and the New York Times publication of the Pentagon Papers, won that prize. And I do think, you know, what we tried to do was do the reporting in the public service. There's certainly been no shortage of individual accolades and honors that Laura and I and even Edward Snowden have received. You know, I feel like we've gotten our due credit and much, much more. And ultimately, it really is true, and I think this has been a little bit obscured, is that we weren't actually out there alone. You know, The Guardian did put its 190-year reputation on the line. We didn't always agree on everything, but for the most part, they did the story very fearlessly and very aggressively. There were teams of editors working on all of our stories. There were other reporters who were very brave and who did great reporting. And I think they deserved the award institutionally, and I think it's obvious that a lot of the reporting that was won was reporting that I did, but they definitely deserve that recognition as well. And I mean, I definitely overall am thrilled with the way the prize was awarded, even though I know there were these internal conflicts that I think are to be expected.
Does it also go to the issue of old media and new media?
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you look at, for example, the way the Washington Post did its reporting, not only did they not send anybody to Hong Kong, which created a big rift between them and their source. But they published, I think, one story in the first several weeks because I think that those were the kinds of rules. I mean, Bart Gellman is a great reporter, but the editors of the Washington Post are very much old style, old media, pro-government journalists, the kind who have essentially made journalism in the U.S. neutered and impotent and obsolete. And The Guardian is very much, especially in the U.S., this sort of newcomer, this outsider, this mostly web-based publication that has more of an internet new media culture. And the reason I went to The Guardian is because they have a history in the past of deviating from this sort of very conservative pro-government line and doing reporting that's in the public interest. And I think that came through in how they stood behind the reporting and really supported it every step of the way.
Can you talk about the website that you are unveiling today that is the backup information and documents with no place to hide?
Yeah, one of the things that I insisted upon and that my publishing company agreed to is that whatever new documents were reported on in the book, I wanted to make sure that they weren't only in the book and available to people who bought the book, but also online for free because it's information that ought to be public. And so simultaneous with the release of the book today, we are publishing online dozens of new documents that are reported on in the book, including some of the ones that we've discussed that I think shine a whole new light on the NSA and various programs that it has adopted.
And what is happening with The Intercept, your new web outlet that you and Laura Poitras and Jeremy Scahill have developed with the support of Pierre Omidyar of eBay?
Yeah, you know, I think we've published 12 or 14 new NSA stories in the 3 months or so since we've existed. And as I said earlier, we're working on ones that I think are going to be among the biggest, if not the most significant NSA stories still to come. And the benefit of it is we have lots of reporters who are working on these with me and lots of editors and lawyers who are helping to make the story right. And we're also simultaneously expanding because we really sort of launched earlier than we were ready so we could do the NSA reporting into the kind of daily news outlet and analysis provider that we intend to be.
Finally, Glenn Greenwald, Edward Snowden. What happens to him now? It's almost the first anniversary of Edward Snowden in Hong Kong with you releasing these documents. He has gotten political asylum for now in Russia. Talk about the debate that's going on in the White House and this country about what should happen to him. He clearly wants to come home.
He does, but he's only willing to come home if he's given a fair opportunity to make his case. And right now that is impossible. You know, there's this sort of bravado that pervades the Washington political class and media class when they talk about Snowden, which is, oh, if he really believes what he did was justified, he should man up and come home and make his case in court. But the way that they have created the rules that govern Espionage Act cases, which is what this would be, is that a defendant charged with violating the Espionage Act is barred from making the very defense that they're trying to lure him into making or claiming he could make, which is, I did what I did because it was justified. That a court would never allow. So the entire playing field of how the U.S. judiciary operates in these cases is completely warped and designed to ensure an unfair trial and an inevitable prosecution. So, you know, he has asylum for a year in Russia. There are strong signs that it's going to be renewed, if not for another year, probably longer. There are also debates in lots of other countries, including powerful and influential ones like Germany and Brazil, about giving him asylum in those countries. So I think his future is relatively bright as far as being able to stay out of a cage in the U.S. prison system for the rest of his life. But where he ends up, I think, is still a question mark. But, you know, for him, I think as long as he's able freely to participate in the debate that he wanted to galvanize and has galvanized, then he will feel very satisfied and happy.
And the debate that it has opened up in the United States, has it surprised you, who began this journey with Edward Snowden over a year ago?
Oh, it's surprised me greatly. I mean, I've been working on surveillance issues for 8 years, and I know the difficulty of trying to induce large numbers of people to pay attention and care about them, because it's a little bit more ethereal and abstract and even a little bit remote than, say, your inability to pay bills or to get health insurance for your children. And the ability that we've had to take these documents and show them to people, as opposed to just reporting on it and making them rely on what we're saying, has been indispensable in engaging the public. I think it really shows the value of whistleblowing, not just for exposing specific programs, but for strengthening democracy and for the debate that is necessary to support it.